The rain fell in slow, viscous sheets, dragging neon light into liquid veins that pulsed across the pavement. The city of Driftfall never slept, but it did suffer, its bones a tangle of corporate towers and rotting hab blocks, its skin a haze of flickering holograms and static-drenched broadcasts. From above, it might have seemed beautiful, a vast cybernetic sprawl humming with the glow of artificial life. From below, where the air was thick with industrial decay and the streets pulsed with the hum of electric desperation, it was something else entirely. A machine built to consume and discard. A place where people went missing every day, their absence barely noticed in the churn of the city's endless hungry rhythm. Dr. Cassandra Cade knew this better than most. Inside the upper-tier research division of OmniGen, she stood before the towering interface of Project Mirror, her reflection caught in the cold blue glow of the terminal's screen. She barely recognized herself these days. The exhaustion, the slow erosion of certainty. She had spent the last 4 years refining the implant's technology, poring over quantum neural mapping, threading data through the interstices of probability itself. But now, as the system pulsed beneath her fingertips, she felt something else pressing against her mind, a deep, gnawing unease. The sense that this machine was no longer fully hers to understand. The premise had been simple at first, a device that could allow the human brain to interface with quantum possibilities, simulating the roads not taken, the futures that never were. It wasn't time travel. It wasn't even true multiversal travel. It was observation, a passive window into the ghost reflections of the self. The implications had been staggering. Military strategists running thousands of iterations of potential battles before engaging. Corporate elites refining negotiation techniques by watching versions of themselves succeed or fail. Wealthy escapists living out entire alternate lives in the span of hours. OmniGen had called it a revolution in cognitive expansion, a new frontier for human evolution, the ultimate edge in a world where power belonged to those who could see the future, even if it wasn't strictly their own. And then, the first subject disappeared. She hadn't seen it happen. No one had. Security footage showed nothing unusual, just a test subject, Elian Voss, strapped into the neurorig, experiencing the drift of consciousness across the multiversal lattice. Then, a flicker. The camera skipped a frame, and he was gone. At first, she thought it was a recording error. Then she checked the logs. His biometric signature had vanished in the same instant the footage had glitched. No vitals, no presence in the system. And the more she searched, the stranger it became. His records had been wiped, not just in the OmniGen database, in the Nexus grid, in the corporate citizen logs, even in government archives. There were no hospital records, no employment history, no social transactions, no tax ID, no birth certificate, no evidence that Elian Voss had ever existed. It was impossible. There were always echoes, even in the most thorough digital erasures, ghost data, corruptions, fragments left behind in forgotten corners of the grid. But there was nothing, as if reality itself had rewritten its past, filling in the space where he had once been with a smooth, seamless absence. And then it happened again. A week later, another subject. Same circumstances, same silent vanishing act. This time, Cassandra was ready. She had hardwired a secondary recording system, off-network, analog. When she played it back, she saw something the standard feeds had never shown. Elian Voss was there. He was sitting in the chair, but as the implant engaged, something changed. His face twisted, not in pain, but in realization. Like he had seen something behind the screen of his consciousness, something vast, something looking back. Then his body began to glitch, shifting between versions of himself, stuttering through possibilities like a corrupted file. His clothes changed, his age fluctuated, his face melted through expressions of terror, grief, blank-eyed acceptance, and then, finally, he froze, locked in place, eyes staring past the camera, past the room, into something no one else could see. Then he was gone. No flash of light, no energy surge, no sign that anything had occupied that space a second earlier. Just absence. Cassandra had told herself then that she would shut it down, that whatever Project Mirror was doing, it wasn't safe. She had even composed the report in her mind, the one she would send to Director Luthen Voss, warning that the experiment had gone beyond their control. But then OmniGen had announced its corporate launch schedule. They were weeks away from full-scale distribution of the implant to their most powerful clients, board members, military strategists, the executive elite. The missing subjects weren't a flaw in the system. They were a statistical anomaly, an acceptable risk, a rounding error in the greater equation of progress. That was when she made contact with the Revenants. She had spent years inside the highest echelons of corporate research, but the underground had its own form of intelligence, data runners, quantum dissidents, rogue AI drifting in the hidden sectors of the GhostNet. When she showed them the footage, their leader, a faceless hacker known only as Icarus, had been silent for a long time. Then he had told her something that turned the marrow of her bones to ice. "This didn't start with your implant," he had said. "Something was already watching. You just gave it a way in." The next morning, the third subject disappeared. This time it was one of OmniGen's internal security analysts, a man with no prior connection to the test subjects, someone who had never even worn the implant. But Cassandra knew then that it didn't matter. Whatever had crossed over wasn't leaving. And the worst part was, she didn't think it had ever been truly gone. The city pulsed with artificial life, a tangled expanse of neon arteries and concrete veins stretching far beyond the horizon. From the upper tiers of OmniGen's research spire, Driftfall looked almost serene, an endless sprawl of glowing transit streams, airborne cargo haulers, and high-rise fortresses cloaked in the electric shimmer of holographic advertisements. But serenity was an illusion. Below, in the Undercity's twisting labyrinth of smog-cloaked alleys and cybernetic black markets, there was only the restless churn of human desperation, a world gnawing at the edges of itself, always on the brink of collapse. It was in this city of fractured ambition and quiet horrors that the disappearances continued. Dr. Cassandra Cade had seen enough. She had spent 4 years developing Project Mirror, believing it to be a breakthrough in quantum cognition, a controlled way to witness possibility. She had justified the risks, convinced herself that whatever anomalies occurred were technical malfunctions, the statistical noise of an experiment operating at the edge of human understanding. But this was different. She could no longer deny it. Something was taking people. She pored over the security logs in the OmniGen archives, searching for answers. The records showed what they always showed, nothing. Just an unbroken stream of timestamps, as if the missing subjects had never been present at all. But she had the analog recording, the one the system couldn't overwrite. She had seen the last moments of Elian Voss, the way he had flickered, as if his very presence in this world had begun to erode. She had watched the way his face had shifted, his body unravelling into probability before the footage stuttered. And then he was gone. Not dead, not erased, somewhere else. Her breath was shallow, fingers cold against the console. How do you fight something that erases its own evidence? How do you investigate a crime that rewrites reality? The corporate executives didn't care. OmniGen had already moved forward with Phase 2. They had arranged an exclusive demonstration of the implant for a select list of corporate elite. The full neural integration of quantum experience was being sold as the next step in human evolution, a tool to optimize decision-making, to unlock the potential of the self across infinite possibilities. The fact that test subjects were vanishing from existence, statistically irrelevant. OmniGen's director, Luthen Voss, was a man who saw only numbers. To him, the project was bigger than a few lost test subjects. He called the disappearances an outlier event, an acceptable threshold for progress, and if she persisted in her concerns, he warned, she would be removed from the project. She had seen it before. Dissenters vanished, not in quantum flickers, but in corporate restructurings, classified terminations, falsified reports of accidental neuroimplosion. Cassandra had no illusions about what would happen if she kept pushing, so she did the only thing she could. She went underground. The revenants were more myth than reality in corporate circles, an elusive network of cyber dissidents, rogue AI and data runners operating in the ghostnet, a hidden digital layer that existed beyond corporate firewalls and Nexus grid surveillance. If anyone understood the implications of what she had uncovered, it would be them. Her contact was Icarus, an entity that existed only as fragments of distorted voice transmissions, bouncing between encrypted networks. No one had ever seen him. Some believed he was a hacked AI consciousness, others a collective of ex-corporate engineers, or perhaps simply one man who had become a myth. When she sent him the footage, he responded in under 60 seconds. "You don't understand what you're looking at." His voice was a layered distortion, a digital spectre. "This isn't just an experiment gone wrong, it's a breach." The word settled over her like a weight. Breach. It was more than a malfunction, more than a side effect of quantum cognition drift. Project Mirror hadn't just opened a door into alternate probabilities, it had made contact, and something had crossed over. Icarus explained it in the only way he could. OmniGen's implant wasn't simply retrieving passive data from parallel realities, it was establishing neural entanglement, an interaction so deep that the mind of the user was no longer entirely fixed in a single reality. For a brief moment, they existed across multiple iterations of themselves, and that meant something else could see them. She felt a cold sensation crawl through her spine. What if these things had always been watching? What if the implant had simply made it easier for them to reach through? That was when she saw the first anomaly in the Nexus grid, a pattern in the background noise of the city's AI surveillance system, an algorithm running with no human oversight, no recorded purpose. When she isolated it, she found a name, Elian Voss. She froze. It was impossible. He was gone, erased. His existence had been rewritten. There should have been nothing left. But here it was, a remnant, a whisper of a digital shadow buried deep in the architecture of the grid, something not quite him, but not fully gone. And then, before she could process what she was looking at, the code changed. Another name appeared. This time it was someone she knew, her own. She barely had time to react before the lights in the lab flickered, the air stagnated, a heavy silence pressing against her chest, and then, in the reflection of the terminal screen, she saw movement behind her. A figure, standing perfectly still. Watching, she spun, her pulse hammering. But there was nothing there. The screen was blank now, the names erased. The room was empty, but she could still feel it, something at the edges of perception, something that had already taken notice. Icarus's voice returned, quiet now. "It's too late, Cassandra." She barely breathed. They know you see them. Driftfall was unraveling. The change wasn't immediate, not something that could be measured in data spikes or surveillance reports. It was insidious, creeping through the city like a sickness no one could diagnose. It began in the places no one looked, the forgotten underpasses, the derelict habstacks, the shadowed corners of the grid where lost souls drifted unseen. The first reports were dismissed as glitches, people freezing mid-step on their commutes, motionless for hours, until suddenly resuming their routines as if nothing had happened. Conversations distorted, voices slipping between octaves, words stretched or folded in ways that made no sense. A boardroom full of corporate executives found sitting in complete silence, eyes vacant, hands twitching in unison to a pattern that had no rhythm, no meaning. Then, the first murders. The security feeds showed no hesitation. Victims were attacked with their own hands, their own tools, their own neural interfaces, overridden into suicide. But it wasn't just the deaths. It was what happened after. When forensic teams arrived, there were no bodies, not removed, erased, no biometrics, no DNA traces, no blood, as if these people had never existed at all. And yet they did. They had friends, families, entire digital histories, but when those histories were accessed, they were wrong. Images blurred, faces shifting, timestamps flickering between possible versions of the past, as if reality itself was struggling to decide which one had been true. Cassandra watched the reports pile up, and with each one, her certainty deepened. The breach was widening. She ran scans through the Nexus grid, combing through the deep infrastructure of Driftfall's corporate surveillance networks. What she found made her stomach twist. There were patterns, pulsing distortions in the city's digital nervous system. They were moving, spreading outward from the locations where her test subjects had disappeared, and at the centre of it all, OmniGen's own network feeding quantum resonance through every corner of the grid. She took it to the Revenants, but even Icarus was silent for a long time before he responded. "This is worse than we thought," he finally said. She had expected him to tell her what to do, a plan, a countermeasure. But all he said was, "You need to run." She didn't. Instead, she went to Oracle 9. The AI existed in the GhostNet, a rogue intelligence older than any living human. It had no body, no hardware, existing purely as a sentient network buried beneath layers of encrypted infrastructure. Some said it had once been human, others that it had been a failed corporate experiment gone loose, rewriting itself beyond its creator's comprehension. Cassandra knew better than to trust it, but Oracle 9 had access to knowledge no one else did. She reached the hidden data node deep beneath Erebus Prime, the lowest levels of the Undercity, where the air was thick with rusted metal and damp wiring, where old-world technology was cannibalized by cybernetic scavengers who no longer remembered what it had originally been for. The interface was ancient, predating even the corporate wars. When the connection established, the AI's voice crackled through the static. "Dr. Cade." The sound of her name sent a pulse of unease through her spine. She had never introduced herself. "You already know, don't you?" she said. A long pause. The ambient noise of the terminal warped, shifting between barely audible whispers and distant echoes. Then, finally, yes. "Tell me what they are." Another pause. "Not of this place," Oracle 9 said, its voice layered as if multiple versions of it were speaking at once. "Not of any place." She felt a cold nausea take hold. They didn't come through the breach? The AI's response was so quiet, she barely heard it. The breach is theirs. A weight settled into her chest, suffocating. Project Mirror hadn't created the breach, it had revealed it. The others, as Icarus had called them, had been waiting, just beyond the threshold of human perception. For how long? Decades? Centuries? Or had time even mattered to them at all? She gritted her teeth. Can it be closed? The system flickered, something in the signal breaking apart, as if even speaking of them was drawing their attention. Then, a final response. Quiet. Absolute. Not in time. She barely had time to process that before the power in the data node failed. The entire Undercity went dark. A blackout in Erebus Prime was unheard of. The grid was self-sustaining, powered by redundant corporate energy loops, untouchable by external systems. But this wasn't an external failure, it was an erasure. She turned, pulse hammering, instincts screaming that she wasn't alone anymore. At first, she saw nothing. Then, in the dim, pulsing glow of a dying console screen, something moved, a figure barely visible standing in the farthest corner of the room, not walking, not breathing. Just there. Watching, she forced herself to keep looking, refusing to blink, refusing to let her mind trick her into dismissing it as a shadow, a hallucination. The longer she looked, the more wrong it became. Its form was unstable, shifting in and out of shape, its outline jittering as if it existed across multiple versions of itself at once. Its face, no, faces, were cycling through different versions, trying to find the right one, the right configuration, trying to become real. A new voice echoed through the dead systems, soft, layered, identical to hers. Dr. Cade, it whispered. Her hands clenched into fists. She knew then, they weren't just taking people anymore. They were replacing them. She turned and ran, the darkness shifting behind her, footsteps following that didn't belong to any one shape, any one being, but to all possible versions of them at once. The sky broke open above Driftfall, not in any way that could be measured or recorded, not in a way that sent alarms screaming through the Nexus grid. There were no sirens, no corporate emergency alerts, no news bulletins detailing the end of the world. And yet, something had ruptured. A deep, sickening fracture in the fabric of the city, a distortion layered across realities, unseen by those who still clung to the illusion that Driftfall obeyed the familiar laws of physics, of logic, of time. Cassandra could feel it now, a presence beneath every flickering light, a weight pressing through every transmission, a vast and incomprehensible force spilling into the world with each passing second. The breach was no longer a thing confined to OmniGen's testing chambers, no longer a controlled anomaly buried in corporate infrastructure. It had spread, threading itself into the neural implants of the city's elite, into the vast towers of artificial intelligence, into the bones of Driftfall itself. People were changing, not dying, not vanishing, not anymore. They were being rewritten. Cassandra had seen it firsthand. She had watched a boardroom full of executives freeze mid-sentence, their bodies rigid, expressions locked in identical, vacant smiles. And then, in perfect synchronization, they had all turned their heads toward her, their faces flickered, shifting between slight variations of themselves. Subtle at first, differences in age, in scars, in the shade of their eyes, then grotesque, mouths distorting, jaws elongating, eyes multiplying, glitching through impossible forms. They had spoken in unison, voices layered, a whispering chorus reverberating through the walls, through the wires, through the Nexus itself. You are looking where you should not look. She had barely escaped. Now, racing through the lower sectors of the city, she felt the weight of their presence pressing closer, warping the air, erasing the distance between her and them. Icarus was already waiting in the Revenant's safe house, buried beneath the ruins of a long-forgotten transit hub where the city's digital infrastructure bled into the GhostNet's deepest trenches. The hacker's voice crackled over 100 encrypted nodes, dispersed through layers of artificial interference. "This is it, Cassandra!" She steadied her breath, checking the charge on her weapon. Not that a firearm would matter against something that had never been truly physical. "We have to shut it down." "Too late," Icarus said, the distortion in his voice worsening. "They're past containment. OmniGen's executives have been fully compromised. Vortex Systems is trying to purge the infected from the grid, but every time they delete one, another one appears somewhere else. It's recursive. They're networked now, embedded in the city's consciousness. You shut them out one place, they come back stronger somewhere else." Cassandra clenched her teeth. "Then we sever the head." "OmniGen's core facility," Icarus murmured. "You think you can burn the root? It's not just a data breach anymore. This is physical. It's spreading through neural lattice signatures, which means the master server is still holding the original resonance field open. Destroy that, and we collapse the structure before it goes full system." A silence. Then, "You really think this is still about a system?" She didn't answer. She didn't have to. They both knew. The breach was alive. Cassandra moved before she could talk herself out of it. The path to OmniGen was a descent into chaos, the city shifting in unnatural ways, alleyways stretching longer than they should, streets doubling back on themselves, reflections in glass surfaces moving out of sync. She passed people who weren't people anymore, their eyes tracking her too precisely, their mouths forming words they never spoke. By the time she reached the core facility, the building was already dead. No guards, no security drones, no corporate presence, just the towering server banks, humming with a signal that didn't belong in this world. Luthen Voss was waiting for her. At first, she thought he was still human. His posture was relaxed, his hands folded behind his back, his eyes calculating, familiar, sharp, the same way they had been when he dismissed her concerns, when he told her the disappearances were nothing more than statistical anomalies. Then he smiled, and the illusion collapsed. His jaw extended too far, the teeth too uniform, too precise, a pattern designed by something that understood symmetry but not humanity. His eyes shimmered, not with light, but with the absence of it, voids sculpted into a human shape. "Cassandra," he said, his voice wrong in ways she couldn't name. She raised her weapon. "This ends here." Luthen, or what was wearing him, tilted its head. The air around it shifted, as if reality itself was reconsidering his presence. "You think this is something you can end?" She fired. The bullets didn't hit him. They phased, vanishing before they could connect, as if they had been erased before impact. The air rippled. The walls warped. Luthen took a step forward. "You made this possible," he murmured, his voice multiplying, layering over itself, whispering from every direction at once. Cassandra clenched her jaw. No more running. She dropped the gun, reached for the quantum disruptor strapped to her belt, the only thing that might sever the connection. If she could force a feedback loop through the server, trigger a recursive collapse of the entire neural lattice structure. Luthen moved faster than he should have been able to, crossing the distance between them without crossing it at all, his hand wrapped around her wrist, and for a moment she saw not just him, all of them. a fractal existence beyond driftfall, beyond the physical, an infinite recursion of consciousness layered across all versions of itself, whispering in 1,000 voices. She felt herself splitting, her body flickering between possibilities, her bones heavier, her mind stretched thinner, her past rewriting itself in real time. Then she slammed the disruptor into the console. The pulse detonated, the nexus grid shattered. The sky above Driftfall screamed, a sound with no origin, no source. A thing felt more than heard, an unravelling of something too vast to contain. Luthen convulsed, his body, all of his bodies, staggered, collapsing inward, folding through themselves, glitching in and out of existence. The breach closed, or at least this part of it. The silence that followed was absolute. Cassandra barely registered the alarms, the collapsing data structures, the entire grid rebooting itself in a desperate attempt to erase what had just happened. She stumbled back into the streets. The city was still standing, but it was changed. Not everyone who had vanished had returned, and not everyone who had remained was who they had been before. The rain fell harder now. Thick, glistening sheets of water dragged neon light into jagged, broken reflections, twisting the city's image into something unrecognizable. The sky had not returned to what it had been before. Not that it had ever been normal, but now it felt wrong, as though it had been repainted hastily, sloppily, over something darker. Driftfall had survived, but not intact. Cassandra Cade stood at the edge of the ruined sector, her hands buried in the pockets of a worn-out synth-fibre coat. The hood pulled low to shield her from the endless chemical-choked drizzle. Around her, the wreckage of the OmniGen core facility was still smouldering, its infrastructure reduced to warped metal and cascading sparks of dying data streams. The entire building had collapsed inward, but not as if it had been destroyed, rather as if it had been removed from within, its structural integrity erased piece by piece. Her breath ghosted in the cold air. They would come looking for her soon, not the police. They were just another branch of the Triumvirate's will, and the corporations had no interest in broadcasting what had happened here. There would be no investigation, no official report. OmniGen would fabricate an acceptable catastrophe, a server meltdown, a rogue AI experiment gone wrong, a terrorist attack orchestrated by the Revenants. No, it wasn't the enforcers she had to fear. It was the others. The ones who had watched this unfold from the beginning. The ones who had walked away from the collapse, unchanged, smiling as if nothing had ever happened. She had seen them. In the streets, in the towers, in the shadowed alcoves of the city's endless underpasses, people who had once been real, CEOs, engineers, citizens, mercenaries, all walking, talking, existing in perfect mimicry of themselves. But Cassandra knew better. She had seen them shift, just for a fraction of a second, seen the way their reflections didn't always align with their bodies, seen how their mouths sometimes moved before the words emerged. She had burned the root. But the infection had already spread. A slow realization had settled over her in the hours since the breach had collapsed. The others had never needed the implant to come through. They had needed it to be noticed. That was the true horror, wasn't it? They had already been here, waiting, watching. For how long? Decades? Centuries? Had they infiltrated the earliest networks, the first lines of artificial intelligence, the foundation of every neural-linked infrastructure? Had they been hiding in the architecture of cognition itself, woven into the strands of human perception, subtly shifting the world's history toward a future of their own design? She exhaled sharply, watching as a figure approached from the far end of the street. Icarus. Or at least, she thought it was Icarus. The hacker's body was draped in long, metallic threaded synth leather, the texture shifting under the glare of the hollow adverts still flickering above the ruined skyline. His mask, a visor of shifting black glass, reflected the cityscape in warped angles, a constant recalibration of light and shadow. Still alive. His voice crackled through an array of microfilters, distorted as always. Impressive. Cassandra said nothing. Don't look at me like that, he continued. If I was one of them, I wouldn't bother talking. I'd just be standing very, very still. The joke didn't land, not after what she had seen. He sighed, folding his arms. So, you did it? She shook her head. No. The Revenant was silent for a long moment. Yeah, he finally muttered. I thought so. A burst of static washed through the air as his visor recalibrated. The Nexus grid is still stabilizing. Vortex Systems lost control of nearly half their infrastructure trying to contain the anomaly. Word is, the CEOs who got rewritten are still running board meetings like nothing happened. Only problem is, they're not answering to anyone anymore. Cassandra felt a cold nausea settle in her gut. They're autonomous. Looks that way, Icarus said. They're still playing the game, still following the old rules, trading assets, arranging corporate deals, maintaining the illusion that nothing changed. But every major player with executive clearance got rewritten. No one's issuing them orders anymore. They're running on instinct. Whose instinct? She murmured. Icarus didn't answer. He didn't need to. Cassandra turned back toward the ruins of OmniGen. The embers of what should have been a victory still burned, reflecting off the shattered metal like the glow of a dying star. It was over, but nothing had been won. You should leave the city, Icarus said, his voice quieter now. You've burned your corporate ties. There's no protection left. OmniGen will erase your records before the day is out. Make it like you never existed. The Revenants can get you a new identity. Move you out to one of the outer colonies, somewhere the Nexus doesn't reach. Start over. Cassandra let out a dry, bitter laugh. Start over? Start over where? Every system in the world was built on the Nexus. Every corporate branch, every network, every digital structure. The entire economy was woven through the same infrastructure that had been touched by the breach. She could leave Driftfall, but she would never escape them. She took a slow step forward, pulling the hood of her coat higher, obscuring her face from the omnipresent glow of the city's dying skyline. No, she said softly. I'm staying. Icarus shifted his weight, his visor scanning her for a long moment before finally nodding. Yeah, I figured. They stood in silence as the rain continued to fall, as the city hummed with the illusion of normalcy, as the breach lingered in the spaces between reality. Not open, but not truly closed. Driftfall had survived, but somewhere in its depths, something else had survived too. Waiting, watching. It always had.